Hey, so lately I did a few projects that required some shallow dados, and it was in a little bit larger panel. And this panel would be a little difficult and unruly to try to run through a table saw. If you tried to register this edge against the fence and run it through, you might have the propensity to twist a little bit, and you would end up binding or end up with a wider or screwed up dado. And then if you were to try to take this panel and set it behind a miter gauge and run it through, it's just a little too wide and it wouldn't quite fit on the table saw. So nothing new, but use a router to cut accurate, precise dados. Using that little guy, I don't know if you can see that, a little flush trim pattern bit. And all I would do is measure from one end down to where you want your shelf or divider to be, instead of making a jig. And I've seen quite a few videos on making a jig for this with a 90-degree angle right here. It's great. So I don't want another jig floating around the shop. So instead, I'm using just two scrap pieces of plywood with a straight edge cut on them. So there we go. I would take this, lay it down here on the marks I put in, and go ahead and clamp that down. Once that's clamped down, take your piece of plywood or whatever material you're using, set it in there, squeeze it together, clamp this side down, pull it out, and use this flush trim bit and run it to your desired depth. If you wanted a little bit looser dado, you could try running one layer of blue painter's tape, which is what I did over here. And you can see there's a little bit of play in there for some glue expansion. For plywood, I don't really like making them loose like that. If I was using regular hardwood or some other type of non-plywood material, sometimes I do like to give it a little bit of extra room. But over here, I didn't use the painter's tape, and you can see that's a nice tight friction fit. So that's what I would use for plywood, and that's what I did here. So let's go ahead and cut a few of those real quick, and I'll show you just how that went. On this first project I was working on, I had some 7-foot long solid oak panels, and there was just no way I was going to be able to use a dado stack on a table saw to do this. I'm going to be cutting a 1/4 inch deep stopped dado in this panel. And then this piece is the panel that I'm going to set into that dado. Since it's solid wood, I like to do the blue painter's tape thing, so I went ahead and put that on there. I already have my lines marked out where I want my dado to be cut. So I set the panel on it, and then I took my two scrap pieces of plywood with a straight edge, and they will act as the guide for the flush trim bit. And because the panel that's vertical in the image is got a little bit of a bow to it, I went ahead and clamped my straight edges to it first to kind of push that bow out of it, and then clamp my straight edges down to the panel that's horizontal. And now that I have my guide pieces firmly clamped to the horizontal piece, I can remove the vertical one and go ahead and just run the router through. Again, this is a stop dado, so I didn't run all the way through. I had a line I was running up to. Now it's just a matter of removing the guides, cleaning out the dado, remove the blue tape, and then we'll try for a test fit. And since I'm doing a stop dado, to hide the end of that roundover, I went ahead and just flush trimmed a little bit off. And now with that done, I can go ahead and set it in place and drive it home. And as you can see, I have a pretty nice, tight-fitting dado cut, and I did it in just a few minutes. Sorry for the poor video quality here, though. And after cutting just a few more of those, I finished this project. It's a nice place to walk in, hang my coat, and put my boots when I walk in. So on the second project, I got a commission to do a big built-in cabinet. And these panels are just too large and awkward to use a dado stack on a table saw again, so it's back to the router with a flush trim bit. So I marked out my lines, and I put an X on the waist side so I don't cut on the wrong side of the line. So now I'll divert over to setting up the router depth. I'm using a scrap piece of plywood, which is from the same stock as what I'm using for the guides. That's important. So I set that scrap piece of plywood on the router base and then use a 1/4 inch setup block to set the depth of the dado that I'm going to cut. If you're cutting a deeper 1/3/8 or whatever, you would just use a thicker setup block. Now with the router depth set, I can move back over and grab one of my scrap pieces of plywood that I'm using as a guide and go ahead and clamp that down, carefully lining it up with the indicator line that I put down. With one side clamped down, I can go ahead and take a piece of plywood out of the same sheet that I'm making the partitions out of it and use that as a thickness guide. Then I can add the other piece of plywood that I'm using as a guide. I apply just a little light pressure inward as I clamp it down. That way I have a nice tight fit on that dado. And since it's plywood, I'm not using blue tape. I want it to be a good snug fit. And then all that's left is to remove the panel and go ahead and run the router through and cut this dado. This one isn't a stop dado, so I can run all the way through. And because I didn't apply very much pressure inward against the panel, this one is slightly loose. It's still a good fit, but I personally like a little bit more of a friction fit than this. So on the next two, I applied more pressure squeezing inward on the guides I'm using, and after I was done with these, I was a lot happier. I had a good tight friction fit. So to sum up, in just a few minutes, without a whole lot of measuring, just setting up a router bit, it's quick and easy to cut these dados with a router. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.